Russia says it has withdrawn from the city of Kherson. So, what does that mean for the conflict? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Russia's defense minister announced on Wednesday the pullback of troops from the city of Kherson. Sergei Shoigu said the move is aimed at protecting soldiers as well as civilians. The United States and its Western allies remain skeptical about Moscow's motives and have been urging peace talks between the two nations. We begin with this report from CGTN's Shamim Chowdhury.
Kyiv has indeed been treating this latest development with extreme caution. The president's advisor, Mikhailo Podolak, tweeted that Russian troops remain in Kherson city. He also added that the Ukrainian intelligence services are using data, gathering information to get a clearer sense of what is going on in and around the area. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president himself, has been very careful with his words. This is what he had to say.
The enemy does not give us gifts, does not make gestures of goodwill. We fight for it all. And when you fight, every step is always the resistance of the enemy. It is always the loss of lives, our heroes. Therefore, we are moving very carefully, without emotions, without unnecessary risk, in the interest of liberating all our land, and so that the losses are as small as possible.
According to the army chief Valery Zaluzhny, the town of Snihurivka has been taken north of Kherson city, and as well as that there have been about 12 or so villages that have been regained by the Ukrainians. Heavy fighting going on in the south and the east of the country despite these gains.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a journalist and Russian political analyst. From Brussels, we are joined by Pieter Cleppe. He is the editor-in-chief of the Brussels Report. From Rhode Island, Vladimir Golstein is the chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University. And from Kyiv in Ukraine, we are joined by Pieter Zalmayev. He is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Welcome to all of you. And let's go to Moscow and start with Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, let's start with this Russian troop withdrawal from Kherson. Western media are describing it as, quote, a major retreat and one of Russia's most significant retreats. The troops now are on the opposite side of the Dnipro River. What's happening here? Is this a major setback, as one United States radio network called it, or is this some kind of military strategic move by Russia?
Well, the officials, the Ministry of Defense and the government, they present it as a purely military move aimed at saving lives of the soldiers, because the war situation would arise if the soldiers were trapped between the Dnieper River behind their backs and the advancing Ukrainian army. But of course, because in Russia, unlike in Ukraine, we have many channels and many news, if you want, news organizations with their views on the war, there are many groups that voice criticism, saying that this is a very, very negative development, especially the emigrants from Ukraine, people who fled the country after the coup in 2014. They are especially sad, They rightly stress the fact that Kherson is the first major city, not a town, not a village, but a city that had been under Russian control for 6 months, basically almost a year. And now it is being given back to the Ukrainian authorities, even though it is well known that they treat very cruelly the people who in any way collaborated with the Russian authorities, including, just taking humanitarian aid or registering with the new authorities. So basically, we have here a whole variety of views, but there is one thing that I think inspires hope. and that I think the majority of Russians want. There are rumors that this surrender of Kherson is a part of a future negotiated settlement. Rumors about this kind of settlement were spread by the Washington Post last week. The newspaper reported that Biden was somehow pushing President Zelensky towards negotiation with Russia. Zelensky has been making contradictory statements in the last few days. He said that he never shut the door close on the negotiations with Russia, even though just a few, a few weeks ago, we heard from him that he would not negotiate with Russia until President Putin is in power, which means would not negotiate for a very long time.
Right.
So a lot of people hope that maybe this surrender is a part of this future deal that would lead to the end of hostilities. And of course, people here, I think just like in Ukraine, want an end to hostilities. So a whole variety of views on this situation, but obviously it is not a victory.
We seem to have lost Dmitry there. Let's go to Pieter Zalmayev in Kyiv. Pieter, as Dmitry told us a moment ago, this was the first major Ukrainian city that fell into the hands of the Russians. Now the Russians have withdrawn. So what does it look like from the Ukrainian side?
Well, obviously, this is a huge blow to Vladimir Putin's prestige, especially considering that about over a month ago, to a great fanfare, he announced in Moscow, in the Kremlin, the annexation of these regions, and he announced that they will be forever part of Russia. And all of a sudden, they're no longer. Kherson is going to be no longer a part of Russia. A huge blow, and don't take it from me, one of Putin's propagandists, Mr. Sergei Markov, called it the greatest Russia's greatest geopolitical tragedy since the breakup of the Soviet Union, So you cannot put any positive spin on it. This is a huge deal, Ukrainians are still cautious. They are warning that this could be a trap. First of all, Kherson has been mined heavily. Russia is already reported to have blown up significant critical infrastructure objects, including electricity, power grids, and blown up a TV station in Kherson. It's not going to make it easy for the Ukrainians, but I think it's likely that it's going to be retreating, and Ukrainians are going to present a lot of problems for Putin when it comes to Crimea, because all of a sudden the roads to Crimea are exposed. They're within reach of Ukrainian artillery, including America-provided HIMARS rockets. So this is going to be very difficult, no matter how you look at it. A major defeat for Russia and a huge boost for Ukraine and Ukrainian Western backers who see that Ukraine is convincingly winning this war.
Right. Pieter Zalmayev, you say this is a huge defeat, a huge blow for Russia. What does it do to the overall status of the conflict? What does the balance look like now?
The balance, well, for the foreseeable, for the next few months, the war will continue, but will be slower. Russia, since it's already facing this inability to win convincingly militarily, will continue raining down its terror upon Ukrainian cities, trying to bomb us into Stone Age, deprive us of electricity. This, I started this interview I have prepared. I have these two candles in case power goes out. It can actually happen at any moment, and I will have to light these up. Obviously, it's not going to do anything. We remain very resolved, to continue to resist. But, so far, I don't see much pressure on Ukraine. We're hearing here and there that, American generals are saying it. Some Europeans are saying it. Let's maybe try to start negotiating. So far, they have not become an avalanche. So far, I think Ukrainians are resisting these calls because their demands remain the same. Their demands remain that Russia withdraw its forces and that Russia, starts paying restitution and hundreds of billions of dollars of damaged infrastructure. Who's going to pick up the bill? It's going to have to be Russia.
Vladimir Golstein, United States media is reporting that with this withdrawal from Kherson, this would leave very little Ukrainian territory in Russian hands. How do you see this? What do you think this was about?
Well, Russians still sort of have, of course, Donbass region to themselves, but I think what we have to do is to take a long view, and long view is like very problematic. We know that every military conflict, now one side winning, now another side winning, but eventually they have to sit down and negotiate. What this loss of Kherson means is that Russia will be more willing to negotiate, more willing to surrender this part or that part to make a deal. And adversely, as you've heard from Pieter, there is this kind of spirit of, we are moving ahead from Ukraine. They probably be less willing. But we all know that sooner or later they have to sit and negotiate. Why? Because Russia actually, you don't want to push the country to the wall. You don't want them to sort of use much heavier weapons, including, nuclear weapons, which they have. So there should be a negotiation. How much else Russians would be willing to give? Definitely not Crimea, and definitely not part of Donbass. But that's kind of how it looks. I also would say that if we look at the history, there was a Crimean War in 19th century where Russia was actually kind of pushed back by England and France. But what it meant is that the country stepped back its reforms, began to change economically, and I think in the long run, that's a move for Russia. And I would add that Russia actually would be moving probably a little bit more to the right, to more conservative side, because that defeat will kind of awaken up nationalism. So that's what's in the long run in terms for all of us.
Pieter Cleppe in Brussels, let's look at how NATO's European members are looking at all these developments in the Ukraine conflict. There have been reports that there is something of a rethink on the part of NATO's European members on the question of what has been referred to as military mobility. And this is part of a new European Union plan, an action plan as it's called, aimed at improving the bloc's ability to move men, rockets, missiles, and tanks across the continent. So how does Europe look at this? I mean, is there fear in Europe that this conflict could still spill over into other parts of the continent?
Well, first of all, of course, NATO allies in Europe are very happy to see the development about Kherson. And as you say, at the European Union level, there has been increased military cooperation. For a long time, this has been the plan of some at the EU level to sort of develop EU military capacity. And to be clear, we're very, very far from that. But it cannot be denied that Russian invasion of Ukraine has contributed to the EU making steps towards, for example, jointly financing, military equipment for Ukraine, and also to do a number of other things. Also, interestingly, France has come up with a new military strategy, and this explicitly endorses NATO. We may remember how a few years ago, French President Macron called NATO to be brain dead. So that's really long gone. NATO has been reinforced, and France, the government of France, in its new strategy, it declares that EU military cooperation needs to happen in close tandem with NATO. So indeed, these are the developments. I think also individually, what you see is that specifically countries like Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, that had been basically ignoring their military capacity and their defense capacity for a long time, are getting their act back together, or finally, rebuilding their defense. So I would say the invasion has been a wake-up call for them.
Dmitry Babich, you mentioned the fact that there are calls now for negotiations to end this conflict, and these calls have been coming from various quarters. We know, for instance, that the United States has been talking to its ally Ukraine about negotiations, about diplomacy to end this conflict. The Ukrainian President, Vladimir Zelensky, he has been laying out the conditions for negotiations, and I want to read to you a bit of what he said. He said, and these are the conditions: restoration of territorial integrity, respect for the UN Charter, compensation for all material losses caused by the war, punishment for every war criminal, and guarantees that this does not happen again. What do you make of those conditions, Dmitry, and how do you think Moscow will respond?
Well, they're exactly the same conditions that our president Putin laid when he started this invasion on February 24th. He also said, restoration of the damaged buildings in Donbass, punishment for all the people who were responsible for these bombardments, probably punishment for the people who ousted the legally elected president in Ukraine in 2014. These demands from Putin were not realistic, and the demands from Zelensky now are also not realistic. Let's be clear-eyed about it. I think real cessation of hostilities can only be achieved not between Zelensky and Putin, but between Russia and the United States, Russia and other allies, so-called allies of Ukraine, who actually take decisions and who can really push Mr. Zelensky towards negotiation and towards serious attitude to negotiation. Basically, the problem was that at least since April, United States has been viewing this conflict as an opportunity to change regime in Russia. They have been denying it, but if you look at the statements, if you look at the newspaper articles in the mainstream press, they had this illusion that somehow Ukraine could be so victorious and Russians could be so upset with Putin that they could achieve their long-cherished aim. Actually, the West doesn't need Ukraine much. What they need is a regime change in Russia. So that didn't happen, and I think that won't happen. And I think both sides, Russia and the West, who are the real adversaries in Ukraine,
right,
they should both understand that they should stop destroying that country because of our ideological differences. I don't agree with you when you say that after leaving Kherson, Russia hasn't got much Ukrainian territory. No, just look at the map. These are hundreds of miles away from Crimea. Kherson is located, it's another region of Ukraine. And Russia still controls much of Zaporozhye, not the capital of that region, but a lot of territory there. And Russia now controls almost all of Donbass, at least the Lugansk region in its entirety.
Yeah.
So basically, Russia still has a strong negotiating position, but there is a bad sign. Blinken, the American Secretary of State, refused to meet with the Russian representatives at the G20 summit. So if there had been a real progress, I think Blinken would not have missed that opportunity. But I never thought much of him as a peacemaker, to be frank.
You're right, Dmitry. That wasn't my opinion that Russia had little territory. That I was just citing United States media reports. But I want to get to Pieter Zalmayev in Kiev. Pieter, how do you see at this stage of the conflict, and if we look at the most recent developments, what is the likelihood of there being negotiations to end this?
Well, first of all, let me just say the previous speaker, I'm glad he acknowledged the invasion. He called it what it is, an invasion. If you remember, a couple of weeks after, during peace talks in Istanbul, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said we never invaded Ukraine. He refused to acknowledge the reality. And also when he says that the 300, it's it would be unrealistic to expect Russia to pick up the bill for Ukraine's, reconstruction. Well, $300 billion plus of Russia's sovereign wealth fund has been frozen in Western bank accounts. So it's actually very, very possible. And who else is going to pay for it? Europe? It's the perpetrator who has to pay, obviously. Okay, when we talk about negotiations, yes, that's sort of the dictum. That's the wisdom, the received wisdom that all wars end in some kind of a peace agreement at the table. People shake hands, etc. I think there's going to be a lot of battle over the formula as far as like which borders Russia will be expected to retreat to. I suspect like the previous one of the previous speakers said, Crimea is a no-go zone, and part of the Donbass is no-go as well. I think the West is going to be increasingly leaning towards allowing Russia to keep those areas frozen and under its control, meaning the pre-24th February borders. Ukraine is still insisting that it can only agree to a full liberation of Ukraine's territory, but whether that position will hold firm will depend, and I suspect that there's going to have to be a compromise found, but I do not see in the foreseeable future Ukraine agreeing and signing off on permanent transfer of Crimea to Russia. Frozen status, maybe, but not much more.
Vladimir Golstein, Russia, for its part, says that it is ready for talks. This is the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova. She was talking recently. This is what she had to say. Let's listen.
Мы по-прежнему открыты.
We are still open to negotiations. We have never refused to have them. We are ready to negotiate, of course, taking into account the realities that are emerging at the moment.
So, Vladimir Golstein, Maria Zakharova, they're talking about realities that are emerging at the moment. What is she referring to?
Yeah, I think she's referring to sort of diminished Russian expectations that, like Dmitry observed, and Russians will be much more amenable to, meeting some of the Ukrainian demands, precisely in the light that, conventional war, turns out, is not a Russian sort of, biggest forte at this situation. They were not quite ready for that. So looking at the reality, of course, they were preparing to this big nuclear war against the United States and NATO rather than this local war. So they will be willing to negotiate something, and they are willing to sort of expect something in return. And that's what she's referring to. So how it will unfold, it's not clear. But what I want to stress is this is one conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which we're discussing, but there is a much bigger conflict kind of on the international stage for the right of various countries to move according to their own plans outside Pax Americana. Right. So for the time being, it looks like it's not just American kind of victory, not just Ukrainian victory, but American victory. But the world is watching. China is watching, Russia is watching, other developing countries is watching. So I think it's the interest of everyone concerned, as Dmitry said, the United States also to sit and negotiate and acknowledge. Russia should acknowledge its modesty in reality. United States also should sit down and acknowledge that there is China, there's Russia, there are different international players, and nobody wants to dance to the tune of either America, either Russia, or any other place. We are living in the multi-interested, multifocal world, and sooner or later that reality will sink in. Until that happens, people will be dying.
Pieter Cleppe in Brussels. The European Union recently announced an 18 billion euro aid package for Ukraine, but we've also seen some pretty big anti-war protests in several European cities against this war, calls for this war to end. In fact, in some instances, there have been calls for certain countries to withdraw from NATO. We also had the Netherlands announce last week, I think it was, that they were lifting sanctions against Russia. They're going to allow 91 of their companies or entities to now trade with Russia. Is Europe experiencing something of Ukraine fatigue right now?
I would say not yet, or at least not to the extent that Putin has hoped. The strategy was quite clear, cut off Western Europe from Russian gas, and hope that then, the increased energy prices would push public opinion to convince, Western European governments to take a different line on Ukraine, to basically start pressuring Ukraine into negotiations. I don't think that's happening. There's several reasons for that. Western Europe seems to be coping for now with gas supplies. Yes, right. There's a big shortage, but they have been able to resupply. The biggest fears are for next winter. Mm-hmm. That said, it's not a secret that Western European governments were always less eager to sort of engage and supply weapons than for example, Poland or the United States.
Right.
So these dividing lines are, of course, clear.
Peter Zalmayev, there also appears to be some weakening of support for Ukraine here in the United States. There was a survey done by the Wall Street Journal which showed that half of Republicans surveyed by the newspaper now say that the United States is doing too much in Ukraine, and the portion of Republican voters who say the United States isn't doing enough to help Ukraine, it's fallen. That's fallen to 17%, and it was 60% not so long ago. And add to that the fact that Republicans are most likely going to be taking control of the House of Representatives here in Washington early next year. And some of them, some members, including the leadership in that party, have said that it's not going to be automatic that Ukraine gets the kind of aid that it has been getting over the last few months. I mean, how much concern is there in Ukraine over these developments?
Much less concern that, let's say, we had before Tuesday, because simply there's kind of not going to be the critical mass of those Trumpian Republicans that have entered Congress in order to be able to sway that position. Because as you know, it's the executive that controls foreign policy. Senate is second to that. For lower house, the House of Representatives.
Yeah, you're right about sorry, Peter. You're right about the executive controlling foreign policy, but it is Congress that controls the purse strings.
Exactly. But like I say, there's no critical mass for that right now to break that inertia. Yes, there's going to be a slackening of support because that's human psychology when it comes to any region of the world. But the Kevin McCarthys of the U.S. Congress, let's put it this way, are simply not going to have the political weight requisite to go against that policy, to try to, to change it, simply because Americans still overwhelmingly support Ukraine. It's slackening, but there's still bipartisan support for Ukraine. It's not really costing America as much as some Republicans are saying. So the inertia will continue for the next couple of years. 24 is going to be another matter. But for now, I think the support will hold.
Okay, and we need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching. Thank you.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.